if it hadn't been for Liz and Andres, I would be a shriveled old man cultivating cultural pessimism without any future. So I'm enormously grateful for Richard H. Driehaus to have supported this very small family, but who is growing into an enormous powerhouse and which could yet again save the world in its downward straits. I introduce Andres Duany.
Thank you, Leon. That's where I learned to speak. Marvelous. An image from Leon. We had a fine professor at the University of Miami who was a modernist. Tomas Lopez, by name. Many of you know him. And Leo came to Key Biscayne to give a lecture. And when he was done, Tomas walked in a modernist and walked out a traditionalist. It was an extraordinary event. He's now a very fine classicist. And that's the Leo I knew, and the Leo who turned around what we were doing. You may know, and it's not been sufficiently mentioned, that we were in a successful practice with Arquitectónica, which was a modernist firm, and a terrific one. And Leo really turned us around. And I also have to thank Peter Eisenman for an instance of open-mindedness, an early instance, because he organized for Leo to come lecture in Miami, which is when we met and where he changed our lives. So thank you, Peter. Thank you. I want to point out, much has been said about Richard Driehaus and his generosity and his intelligence, perspicacity in knowing what's important. But something I've come to know that I think is as, if not greater importance, it's his enthusiasm. Whatever he does with enormous enthusiasm, and I've really enjoyed getting to know him. And I think that enthusiasm, the energy of enthusiasm, is very important to move things forward. And most of us here are enthusiasts about this very great thing, traditional architecture and urbanism. Traditional architecture and urbanism is a tremendous asset in the sense that it can add value. Now, I'm going to disclose the way we think so you know what some of our success may come from. And this is the way we communicate with the people in the real world. For example, I would show a perfectly functional residential box to a developer, and taking the open prefabricated system, which is the classical language, 2 columns and a pediment, nicely done, perhaps $6,000, you put it on the building, and the building sells for $26,000 more than it would have. And we said, is there anything else you can do that will add value like the classical language? Argument done. So classical architecture communicates. It's a tremendous asset. It is also traditionalism, traditional architecture and classical architecture, because it communicates to the middle class, can insert into the discussion, into the mix that they're exposed to, into the decisions that they can initiate a dialogue which can cause them to make certain decisions that are better for themselves and for others, such as community. The harmony that comes from the classical language designed by a disparity of people allows a lot of energy to be applied to a single place that is intrinsically harmonious. The efficiency of people working together because of the shared knowledge of the classical language is very, very important in the 21st century. So the classical language is of service as well. And the third thing, and this is where Richard and our enthusiasm comes from, it's a fascinating thing to practice. And it requires a certain audacity, because when one does do a classical building, one is being compared immediately and inevitably to some of the greatest architects that ever lived. You're in the ring there with Lutyens, you're in the ring there with Palladio. How did you do? Those other architects who invent their own language, however brilliant, are only in the ring with themselves. Like Peter Eisenman is the champion of Eisenman-esque architecture. You know, there are no other contenders. He writes the rules and he wins. And I think it's very clever. It's a very clever trope, but we are the braver. And one of the things I have always said, if Eisenman, who incidentally is a better architect than he ever was every day, but nevertheless is less and less noticed. You know, he does bigger buildings to get published less than the early houses. If he were to do a classical building, if he were to engage that if he were to enter that ring, which is the ring where he could be judged, it would be an absolutely spectacular performance. I believe he would do very well indeed, and he might actually be noticed again. It's about virtually the only thing that remains to be done by all of these avant-garde architects that have explored every shape and every form and everything that could be cantilevered and made upside down and made impossible. Of course, the heroes are the engineers and the clients in all of this, but it is the only thing that could truly interest us now is if they actually engage in the ultimate test and get in the ring with Lutyens and Palladio, where they can be judged. They may, because they really are very good. So this traditional architecture, this traditional urbanism, is a terribly important thing. It is our role, I think, what we have contributed is to make it more of a collective endeavor, to take its natural abilities to be a collective endeavor and to take it out of the garage and take it for a drive. This collective endeavor requires that credit be given, and perhaps even by name, because that which is the image that you all see there, that the projected physical image of what DPZ has done is really primarily the work of others. You know, we may have organized it, but it's primarily the work of others. And many of them bear mention because they were with us so early. They were there right at the beginning. Now, there's a huge number of new urbanists, and there's a huge number of classicists. The Congress for the New Urbanism meets next week. 1,400, 1,600 people will attend. I mean, it's amazing to have a movement like this and people all thinking a certain way, challenging each other and moving forward together is very unusual in a world of individualism, which is the architectural world. But there's certain people who were there at the beginning. But for not having met Robert Davis, they may be up here with us. And among them in the audience are people like Robert Orr and John Massingale and Dhiru Tadani, and people who have added tremendous power by their ability to organize, people like John Tordy, Neil Payton, who was there right at the beginning. I mean, they were there when there was one house at Seaside. They were there testing the code when nothing had been built. An awful lot of people. And then, without making any distinction between designers and developers, there's Buff and Johnny Chase, Robert and Darrell Davis, David Tomes, Craig Robbins, people like that. These developers that Liz said, you know, take risks to get this built. They are as knowledgeable about architecture. They have to be as knowledgeable about about architecture as we have to be about development in order to really communicate. And they deserve to be actually mentioned. And one more thing, Liz mentioned our teachers, and one needs to be emphasized. Vincent Scully, Dimitri mentioned that at Yale and at Princeton, only modernism was being taught, and that is true. It was being taught. But nevertheless, there was a short window in the late 60s and early 70s when there was a genuine open-mindedness about architecture, both traditional and modern.